Is everything going wrong in France? Find out now. France is one of the most successful economies in history, but in the last decade, it has lost, for many unfortunate but necessary reasons, what originally made it special in many ways. France was one of the first countries in the world to undergo an industrial revolution, but it followed a slightly different path from its European competitors, preferring a more gradual approach that favored small craft industries over the large factories that were becoming the global mainstream. In part by choice and in part because, for better or worse, they lost their most skilled workers before they even realized the importance of specialized labor. This slow development, in a period of rapid growth in global prosperity, meant that France built an economy in which workers were valued in the same way that other countries valued the factories in which they worked. This historical trend has continued to this day, and French workers, more than in any other country in the world, are known for asking for exactly what they want, and in the most impressive way. However, this unique past has brought France an equally uncertain future. If you find the video you watch useful, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and support us with a donation. Your help is precious to us and will allow us to continue producing quality content for you. You can do it here below, through the appropriate buttons, subscribe, and thanks. Today, France finds itself between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it cannot afford to continue to manage its economy as it does today, due to a series of unfavorable national and global challenges. But on the other hand, it cannot afford to make the necessary changes, some of which will be radical. The compromises that France is making are just as bad. Where France was once famous for having been able to balance a relatively egalitarian lifestyle with cutting-edge industry, now one of the richest men in the world makes his fortune with simple leather bags and trinkets. Obviously, one man and one industry are not everything and not always in a national economy, but they are a sign of change, and the loss of unique economic principles can leave a country no more than a less competitive copy of any other developed Western economy. But to understand these challenges and these difficult choices, as always, it is necessary to answer some simple questions. Why does France need such radical economic reforms? And finally, what will happen to France if it continues to stagnate? If France invests heavily in sectors such as education and other public services, it can at least hope to stimulate the economy and further finance public spending in the future. The Industrial Revolution was one of the most important, if not the most important, events to happen to humanity in a few centuries, which by historical standards flew by in the blink of an eye. The development of machines and technologies to increase the amount of materials that a single worker could produce transformed societies around the world, from societies of farmers to rich and comfortable consumer societies. The development of machines and technologies that allowed the production of a greater quantity of goods that everyone can enjoy is what economists call capital development. Before the advent of these machines, the economy functioned almost exclusively on land and labor. The only way to develop an empire was to increase the amount of land cultivated and the number of people working it. However, the development of the third factor of production, capital, made even a world empire in expansion a difficult undertaking for those who had the best technology. It should also be recognized that those who were able to develop this capital, the capitalists, became richer than landowners and kings could dream of, and gave rise to exponential growth in the human population, world wealth, and use of limited resources. This happened in most countries, but in France it was a bit different. The Industrial Revolution is not a case where everyone becomes farmers by pressing a switch and a moment later works on a production line. Despite France being one of the first countries to embrace industrialization, the transition to basic automation was a bit slower compared to other European countries. Historians have different theories on the specific reasons, but in general it was a matter of stability and trust. A few decades before the Industrial Revolution, France went through its own revolution and subsequently was at the center of a series of regional wars. France also suffered from an exodus of skilled workers in the period leading up to the Industrial Revolution. These were mostly Protestants fleeing religious persecution, but many of them were aspiring mechanics and engineers whose skills were highly valuable to a country eager to build steam engines and mechanized factories. Even if at the time these men did not leave the country in search of better economic opportunities, it was one of the first cases of brain drain in history, which still haunts France today. The story of this event is fascinating, but the economic implications are that while the rest of Europe was beginning to develop a modern economy in which large companies dominated huge industrial empires, the French economy was still dominated by many small craft industries. As a result, While in other industrialized economies human labor was often literally thrown into the meat grinder of emerging industries, French workers were able to maintain much greater power over their employers because there were so many small businesses promoting industry. Monopolies are usually considered a non-ideal situation in economics. This is because a company can raise prices or lower quality standards and there is no other choice because there is nothing else that can be done. The alternatives to monopoly are duopoly, in which two companies dominate a sector, oligopoly, in which only a few companies dominate a sector, and perfect competition, in which a nearly unlimited number of companies compete with each other. Generally, when evaluating the problems of oligopolies and monopolies, most people, even economists, focus on the problems that limited competition creates for consumers. If only one company produces a computer, if a consumer wants to buy it, it doesn't matter what price the company sells it at. That will be the price they will have to pay. This is a problem, but an even bigger problem is the impact on workers. Even if people have to spend a little more on low-quality computers, there is nothing worse than having only one potential employer trained for computer production. If a company controls an entire industry, it can lead to lower wages for workers, because they have nowhere else to go. This is the opposite of a situation of perfect competition, in which many small businesses compete for customers and workers. The French economy grew more slowly than other European countries with a highly concentrated industry, but it laid the foundation for a more egalitarian culture. In turn, French industry was a bit less productive than German, British, and especially American industry, and wages were always a bit lower, despite France being a highly industrialized and developed country. This was particularly evident in the post-war period, when French workers and most of their European counterparts worked more hours than their American counterparts, while total production was still lower. France once again sacrificed its gross domestic product for a more balanced lifestyle, but with a greater emphasis on good working conditions, greater job security, and secure pensions. It was a compromise that was fine for most French workers. In fact, for most of the country's modern history, after the post-World War II reconstruction efforts, any attempt to question these conditions and labor protections has met with resistance. Well, let's say the resistance it deserved in 1940. This led to the formation of the strong arm of the government, another key element of the modern French economy. France has been a capitalist country for 2 centuries. However, during this period, the influence of the free market in some sectors has been tamed by strong government intervention. On the one hand, a plethora of small businesses can be a boon for workers, but on the other hand, there are also advantages to having a smaller number of large businesses in the economy. After World War II, France realized this weakness and the government took an active role in remedying the situation. This was an economic policy called deindustrialization. Many French speakers apologize for my pronunciation. However, translated it means that the government directed the economy by shaping the industries it considered important, but welcomed the development of private industry alongside public projects, or even in competition with them, when it became feasible. The government created public enterprises such as state banks, high-speed railways, Air France, and even Minitel, which could be defined as the Internet before the Internet. In short, it was a compromise between the two main competing ideologies in the world at the time. Communism, in which the state owned all industry, and pure market capitalism, in which the role of the state in the economy was only to regulate competitive private industry by creating state-owned enterprises in a free market. France sought to have the best of both worlds. The existence of these enterprises was financed by the state not only because they could be truly profitable investments, but also because it was important for the country that these services be provided by organizations capable of providing them on an adequate scale. Despite the advantage for workers and consumers of having many small businesses competing with each other, a service provider such as an airline would not be able to operate efficiently with only 10 employees to provide a complete network of routes and all associated infrastructure. This would require thousands of employees and billions of dollars of investment from the government. From a purely macroeconomic perspective, governments have nothing special about them. In a sense, they cannot be considered anything other than monopolies that provide certain goods and services, with one small difference. When private businesses decide what and how to produce, they look at what they can sell, and if they can produce it in such a way that the selling price is higher than the cost of producing that good or service, they will do it. Governments also exist to provide goods and services to participants in the economy, but with a different motivation. In fact, governments do not earn by selling goods and services, but by taxing citizens. This is a very efficient way of providing goods and services that cannot be traded. Things like national defense, emergency services, and a functioning legal system require resources to be provided, but are only effective collectively, so it is difficult for each individual to pay voluntarily. Some extreme economists argue that all these services can be provided by the private sector, but in reality public organizations, which do not have to worry about the direct profits of these goods, are a much more efficient way of providing things like police organizations. Government sales and marketing departments or tax departments, handcuffs for those who do not want to pay contributions to the budget, and are very efficient in providing certain goods. On the other hand, there are goods and services that the private sector can provide more efficiently thanks to free and competitive markets. State-owned airlines, state-owned banks, and state-owned manufacturing companies may have efficiency problems due to their monopoly on the market, making it difficult to enter markets where their competitors have the financial backing of the entire country, even if private companies are technically allowed to compete with them. These public enterprises also tend to behave differently in the way they produce goods and services. While normal private companies seek to keep costs as low as possible to maximize profits, public enterprises often pursue other objectives in the public interest that may not be the most efficient use of resources. A notable example is that private companies seek to minimize the number of employees to reduce costs, while public enterprises seek reasons to hire more people because high levels of employment are politically popular. In other cases, national airlines produce goods and services that are not economically profitable, such as serving low-demand routes between countries. In this case, even the United States, which does not have a national airline, has a program that pays private airlines for low-demand routes. In France, the system is extreme, and the strong emphasis on state-owned companies during the collapse has caused the economy to regress in terms of efficiency and production. Alone, this might not be a problem. But it is. But France, despite being one of the first countries to successfully industrialize, has begun to close the gap with other developing countries. Developing European countries have moved from an agriculture-based society to an industry-based society, but France no longer has the relative economic power it once had. As a result, France looks like a rich and developed country, with modern infrastructure and technology, but has a rather backward economic profile, with high unemployment, low labor productivity compared to other developed countries, and relatively slow economic growth. The main reason is not a lack of resources or unbridled capitalism, but a lack of investment in infrastructure, education, and innovation. France invests heavily in social sectors such as education and health, but neglects other sectors that are equally important for economic growth. Infrastructure is neglected, with roads, bridges, and railways in poor condition. Education and training of the workforce is also neglected, leaving young people without the skills needed to compete in the global economy. Finally, innovation is neglected because governments do not invest enough in research and development to advance the economy. The solution to this problem is not easy, but one thing is clear. France must invest more in infrastructure, education, and innovation if it wants to compete in the global economy of the 21st century. If France does nothing, it risks being overtaken by other countries that invest more in these sectors. For France not to be overtaken by other countries, this problem must be addressed urgently. France has long been a world leader, but risks losing its status as a world power if it does not address its economic problems. France must make difficult choices in favor of economic reform or risk falling behind. Strong measures must be taken to reduce unemployment, increase productivity, and stimulate innovation. This includes investments in infrastructure, education, research and development, and labor market reforms that make it easier for companies to hire and fire employees. In addition, France may have to address public spending and debt to reduce the budget deficit and stabilize its fiscal position. However, any economic reform will also have to face strong resistance from French society, including unions and other interest groups that may oppose changes that threaten their interests and privileges. Ultimately, France is facing serious economic challenges, the solution of which will require strong political and social will. What was your experience with the topic covered in this video? Tell us about it in the comments, we are curious to know. And if you have any doubts or questions, don't hold back. Leave a comment, even just a simple like would be perfect, but most importantly, subscribe to the channel to stay informed about upcoming releases.